Welcome to Book Club. I'm really into fun facts. Julie has an endless array of pop culture knowledge. Overall, I would say I liked it.
Something about the way she writes is like really concrete and immediate. Who is this man? Why is he in this costume? Like, why did he drop a squid? Like, you teased some juicy deets about the creation of this book.
This is, again, what Victoria finds interesting, not what is actually most important about these people.
What stories are we going to tell ourselves about this year?
Welcome to the party.
Welcome, guys.
Welcome to Book Club
with Julia
and Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as a tool for personal and community growth.
This week, we are reading the classic, Beloved by Toni Morrison, and there are major spoilers in this book. So, if you are a person who cares about having a book spoiled for you before you read it, this is your official warning.
Yes, and if you haven't read it but you just don't care about spoilers, you are so welcome here. We are excited to dive into this book and the genre of horror in general. It's going to be a good time. So, Julie and I have had this book on our collective shelf for quite some time.
Yeah.
I feel like this book has such a story to it. beyond the story between the pages, or between the covers.
It's our book child.
It's our book child. Julia was visiting me in Cambridge while we were both studying abroad in England, and there was a big street festival on Mill Road that we went to, and there was a bookshop that on the street they had a whole stand with these wrapped books, presents. And for £2 or something cheap, you could just pick up any of them and it was a surprise and you unwrap it. Julie and I, being broke college students who also had limited luggage space, said, let's get one book together. And so we both chipped in and we picked up a book. I mean, you can kind of eyeball what kind of book you're going to get. My friend got a recipe cookbook in hers because she's like, oh, this one's small and hardback. That's cool. But we, went for the generic fiction size paperback.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it turned out to be Beloved by Toni Morrison. So the edition that we've read is actually the UK printing.
Oh, wait, really?
Yeah. I mean, the cover's got a quote from The Guardian. Yeah. It's from Vintage, Random House's imprint in London, published in 1997. So 10 years after. This was the 10-year anniversary printing, I guess. Anyways, so that's when we got the book, but I don't remember anything personally of what was going on when I actually read it. I do know we were living in Chicago, so it's probably around 2018 that I read this for the first time. But otherwise, I had so few memories of this book. When Julie and I prepped for the episode, or when we started discussing doing this on the podcast, I'm like, I think I finished that one, ? What happened? And so I definitely did a summary reread and reintroduced myself with the book. I'm like, oh, right, I do remember this ending, so I did finish it. But what I do remember of reading it the first time was being surprised that it was a horror novel. Surprised that I actually stuck with it and really enjoyed it. Yeah. Usually if I find out something is horror or terror in that kind of realm, I'm like, yeah, okay, not for me, and I put it down or don't even pick it up in the first place. So this was a different read, a little outside my normal genre, though being a historical fiction that is kind of in my wheelhouse too, so wasn't too far afield for me.
Yeah, I feel like it's the same for me. I have absolutely no memory of when I read this book. I remember, though, similar thing for me where, I don't really read horror very often. And I don't normally like watching horror movies. You will never catch me dead watching American Horror Story on TV. I think neither of us really knew, we knew the name of Toni Morrison, and we knew that she was a big deal and that we should read her books. And I think it was one of those things where, we caved under the pressure of what readers should read. And because she'd won so many prestigious awards, I put her in the category of like quote unquote literary fiction, right? Her as an author, I put her there in my mind. And so like I was not really prepared for the kind of book that this was. But at the same time, the style like sucked me in. I remember being kind of entranced by it. And I think part of the reason it's really hard to remember the experience of reading it, besides like this vague sense of feeling like a dream, is the way that she writes it. Her style is very dreamlike, and we're going to talk about that more in a minute. But I think that contributes to why it feels like I read this in an alternate reality, and I'm trying to remember, it's like it sort of exists outside of time, but a very visceral memory that I have of the book. There's two of them. There's the scene where Baby Suggs has this kind of, it almost had a similar vibe to me of like a seance in the woods, this kind of spiritual thing that existed outside of time. And then the like, oh shit moment when you realize that Setha killed Beloved.
Yeah.
Spoilers! That like, holy shit kind of like brain exploding moment where it just sinks into your body and you're like, oh, I was not expecting that, really, really stuck with me and is the main reason why I remember liking it. So to me, that's a sign of a good horror book, right? Where the big reveals are like really, you just do not see them coming. So yeah, that's like my main experience of this book is like, I went to an alternate reality and read it, but I remember the ending. So I understand you did a lot of research for this author bio, so I'm curious to hear.
Yes. Well, here's what happens, is that I sit down and do these author bios, and often when we read a younger author, a contemporary author, there's just like some basic information about them out there. But when we read some of these like, huge names, like the biggest names in literature, there's so many details and all of it feels so important to share, and it's like available everywhere as far as like all this stuff about their lives. So I'll give, the greatest hits of Toni Morrison, maybe not even greatest hits, the high level things to know about Toni Morrison. So most of this comes from the National Women's History Museum website, as well as a slew of other things when I Googled, tell me more about Lorain, Ohio, and random things like that. So anyways, if you aren't aware of Toni Morrison, she is one of the most celebrated authors in the world. And in addition to writing plays and children's books, her novels have earned countless prestigious awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, which she won for Beloved, as well as the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama. And she was the first African-American woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. As a reminder, Nobel Prize in Literature is for like your whole career, whereas Pulitzer is for an individual book. So she won all the things. There's so many other awards, but I won't go into it. Just know there's a lot. When she was born in 1931, her name was Chloe Wofford, which I found interesting.
What?
Yes.
This is blowing my mind.
So the name thing, I was like, that's fascinating. Because when she was 12, she converted to Catholicism, which I want to learn more about that. And she was baptized. Her Christian baptized name was Anthony, after Saint Anthony of Padua. He's also the patron saint of lost items. Like if you lose your keys or something, many Catholics will pray to Saint Anthony. This is that Anthony. So when she took her Catholic name, she started going by Toni. So like as a child, she was Chloe, but from her like young preteen years on, she was known as Toni. I don't know. I feel like many of my friends who are Catholic, like they have a name when they were baptized or confirmed, but it's not the name they go by necessarily.
Right.
But she like took it completely. So growing up during the Great Depression, while Lorain, Ohio was a pretty semi-integrated area, Morrison herself called it a melting pot of sorts, where you have this large industrial community with a big increase of European immigrant population, as well as many Black people leaving the South to come live in this area. There was still, racial injustice that she faced. When she was 2 years old, their landlord, who was white, set their apartment on fire when the Morrison when the Wofford family couldn't make rent. Her parents had both kind of fled the South to settle in the Ohio area. And Lorain, Ohio, for context, it's along Lake Erie, and it's about 12 miles from Oberlin College, which is known for being the first university to admit African-American students. So that kind of gives you a context of the area she grew up in. And when she was ready to go to college, she attended Howard University and graduated with a bachelor's degree in English. She then immediately went to get her master's in English from Cornell University. She taught at Texas Southern University and later Howard. She returned to her alma mater to teach. Fun fact, she was Stokely Carmichael's professor.
Shut up!
Yeah. And it was during her time teaching there that she met Harold Morrison, a Jamaican architect whom she married. Together, they had 2 children, 2 sons, Harold and Slade, though they divorced about 6 years after they initially got married. So after that, she worked in publishing. She moved to Syracuse and worked for the textbook division of Random House. That kind of like was her foot in the door to the publishing industry. She eventually moved to New York City to work in Random House's fiction department, and she was the first female Black editor of fiction at Random House. Then she begins writing. I mean, she's been teaching English, she's been publishing and editing, very much in the literary world, but she publishes her first novel at the age of 39. The book is called The Bluest Eye. It was published in 1970, and she quickly saw success in her writing. Her second novel, Sula, was nominated for a National Book Award, and by her third novel, she was, quote, a household name. Song of Solomon was that third novel, and she, at this point, quit working in publishing in order to write full-time. She wrote a ton more. You can see her whole list. We'll link it in our show notes of all the essays and novels and short story collections and children's books, but today we're talking about Beloved. Beloved was published in 1987, and it's actually inspired by the true life incident involving Margaret Garner, who was an escaped slave from Kentucky who fled to Ohio. And very similarly, she was captured in accordance with the Fugitive Slave Act, but when the U.S. Marshals came to take her and her family, they found that she had killed her 2-year-old daughter and was attempting to kill her other children to spare them from being returned to slavery. So after reading about that story, Toni Morrison decided to take that account that she read in a newspaper clipping from the time when the event happened and kind of flesh that out into a larger story, speaking to that individual experience, but also to the wider experience of enslaved people and escaped slaves in America during that time.
Oh, that adds so much to our discussion, and I can't wait to get to it now.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. That was a good nugget in my research that I was excited to share with you because I figured it would get your wheels spinning. There's so much more about Toni Morrison. We could talk for a long time about all of her accolades and awards and life experiences. Notably, she taught at Princeton University for a long time. She received an honorary doctorate from Oxford. Additionally, Morrison was asked to be a guest curator at the Louvre, and she wrote children's books with her son until he passed at the age of 45. Ultimately, Morrison died in 2019 from complications of pneumonia at the age of 88. I feel like often when we talk about really prolific authors, obviously it's not one or the other, but often we talk about writers like Charlotte Bronte, who wrote incredible work and then died very young, and you're like, oh, what could they have been? And I feel like Toni Morrison is one of those examples of someone who had a long and successful career that we were able to see so much work come from and see her own ideas and work kind of evolve over time before she passed at like a late age. Yeah, that's Toni Morrison, and I'm sure I left much out. So if you have a favorite thing you know about Toni Morrison or a favorite quote or something, DM us. We'd love to hear.
Okay. Well, this book is tricky to summarize, so I'm gonna be fairly general here because it exists kind of in 2 different timelines, and not a lot happens on like a day-to-day level, you know? It's a lot of like sitting around the house and like thinking thoughts about, you know, and remembering things. That's kind of the plot. So basically, present day timeline, a woman named Setha and her daughter Denver live in this kind of haunted house. The address is 224, and so they call the house 224. It's like it has a name, basically. They don't call it home, they call it 224. And the plot sort of gets started because a man from her past shows up. His name's Paul D. And they sort of begin a relationship. And it starts bringing up memories of basically how they know each other is they were enslaved at the same place. And he also knew Setha's deceased husband. And a girl shows up who Denver and Setha believe is the embodiment of Setha's dead daughter, who they call Beloved, who they think has been the one haunting the house this whole time. But Beloved shows up in like a physical form, and all of these memories get stirred up. And so we follow kind of the plot of Setha's life, of how she got herself to freedom and how she ended up where she is now. And she comes to live with her mother-in-law in free territory. Her mother-in-law's name is Baby Suggs, and she's kind of a spiritual leader in their town. So we sort of move back and forth between flashbacks and present day, kind of exploring Setha's story. We learn about how her husband died, how they got to freed land, and eventually we learn how Beloved died and why Setha and Denver are so sure that the person haunting their house and the physical form of this girl is her dead daughter. And we find out it's because Setha killed her and was planning on killing all her children so that they wouldn't be taken into slavery when her former slave master shows up. Yeah, that's the kind of oh shit moment that I was referring to earlier. Because you sort of go the whole time assuming that the really cruel slave master is the one who killed Beloved, and then you find out that it was Setha herself. So that's the story, and it sounds a lot like the real, very real story that it was based off of. So that is, well, we'll get into it in a second.
This podcast is made possible by our fantastic book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. Starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive posts and messages, get early and discounted access to future events, and more. And if you want to take your support to the next level, you can join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community? A possible neurodiverse person looking for resources? Or an ally hoping to learn more from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get free access to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. Follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. That's buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. We'll see you there.
The reason we wanted to talk about horror is because the two of us, as we've previously stated, are not horror connoisseurs.
No.
I think it's safe to say.
Yeah, I've watched a few horror movies.
Against your will?
Yeah, I mean, kind of coerced into that. And I've only read like a couple books that would fall kind of in the horror or suspense. I've read more like suspense, but in the horror genre. And I'm generally not a fan of this, like, let's get scared to be scared. I don't know. I'm sure there's many more nuanced reasons why people enjoy horror. But this book, I don't want to say it tricked me because I could have, read a sentence about it and would have known it was horror. But it doesn't advertise itself as horror. Like the cover of the version we have has like a dandelion on it. So, I mean, and like we stated, we just kind of randomly got this book from a book sale. And, but I did really I found it really interesting and I was really drawn in by it. And yeah, I'm excited to use this episode to kind of talk about horror and then specifically how Morrison uses it to address the Black experience in America.
Yeah, as soon as we started poking at like what genre is this book and why is that interesting, it reminded me so much of the phenomenon that was Get Out, Jordan Peele's directorial debut. And I just remember reading so many interviews with him that he did sort of on his press tour, and it really opened my eyes to the fact that, like, there are so few Black horror filmmakers or writers. But his argument when he would sit down and they would be like, why did you want to make this movie? And he's like, well, I'm a huge horror fan, but my favorite horror movies were always ones like Rosemary's Baby or something that, like, spoke directly to real fears that are sort of bubbling under the surface of current society and real conflicts that are happening, you know. And his argument was like Rosemary's Baby was about the way that society was being shaken up by the women's liberation movement. And so, you know, as people were gaining more power, things were being shaken up, and there were all these kind of fears and uncertainties happening below the surface. And so he wanted to use that to talk about the Black experience in America, and he felt that horror was the best format for that, for him, obviously. And I found that so fascinating because, I mean, it makes so much sense, right? That, like, the treatment of enslaved people was genuinely horrific. Like, if you could call anything horror, I think you could very easily say that, you know, the fact that, like, the big reveal in this book that Setha killed her daughter was real, that you don't need to embellish American history to make it horrific. You just need to format it like a horror novel. That's all you gotta do, right? And so, yeah, I feel like that moment of reading all those interviews with Jordan Peele has really drastically changed how I view the genre and has given me a bigger appreciation for it. I don't, like, seek it out, but, like, you know, intellectually I appreciate why it exists and what it does. And so that's kind of the lens that we wanted to take to, like, understand this novel.
So, being the prolific researchers that we are, we Googled elements of horror to kind of walk through what defines the horror genre, and specifically, like, how Morrison uses it. So, of course, we found things like suspense and monsters and unsettling qualities, something that's like a mystery, all these different things to kind of, like, add up to, like, what makes it scary, as well as some kind of straightforward plot lines, like, as horror.fm refers to as the complex discovery plot. So you start out with the onset or existence of a horrific event, so there's evidence of it, discovering its cause, confirmation of its cause, and then confrontation that leads to either victory or defeat, depending on how you're looking at it. So those kind of elements we see, and it's not, you know, like a 1 + 1 = horror. You know, you don't just, like, mix all these elements together and you have a, you know, Pulitzer Prize winning novel. Obviously Morrison is doing a lot here. But yeah, let's start out with the style and how Toni Morrison is approaching horror.
Yeah. Like, for me, the first thing that tipped me off that this wasn't just regular historical fiction was her style of writing. She's got this very, like, it's very melodic and artsy, but in, like, a really creepy way. It's, like, really otherworldly. It, like I was saying, reading it kind of felt like a dream, like something that happened to a different version of me. Like, the way her prose is just really, I guess, bizarre in, like, the literary sense, you know, of being kind of outside of the norm. Her sentences kind of move around a lot, and she uses punctuation, sometimes she doesn't. She moves between quotation and thought, similar to Woolf, actually, in a way, where she moves in between people's minds in a way that you're never quite sure where you're at physically. Like a creepy version of Mrs. Dalloway with murder.
Plus murder. I think the jumping around in time part that you mentioned, or, like, whose point of view are we seeing this from? That's what really, like, threw me off. And I think the first time reading, it took me a little bit to get into and understand like what is happening. Whereas reading it the second time around, I feel like I had more of appreciation for the style and like could see what it was doing instead of just being like, wait, who's talking now? Like, where are we in time? Because it literally will just shift. There'll just be very subtle clues. Either it's a brief description of place or just like one little phrase to clue you in. Okay, now we're jumping to a different time or a different place, a different point of view. And there's some chapters that just kind of stand ambiguously. There's a whole section that I believe is kind of from Beloved's perspective, and there's no punctuation. Talk about style. I mean, the page itself looks kind of creepy because it's just like phrases all thrown together. And it's kind of this, like, are we getting Beloved's almost childish point of view, you know, like doesn't have complete language structure accessible, or if it's just like a train of thoughts. But yeah, it's a little, I mean, I'll read a passage of it, I guess. It's easier to see on the page than to hear, but we'll read a little bit of it. All of it is now. It is always now. There will never be a time when I am not crouching and watching others who are crouching too. I am always crouching. The man on my face is dead. His face is not mine. His mouth smells sweet, but his eyes are locked. Some who eat nasty themselves. I do not eat. The men without skin bring us their morning water to drink. We have none. At night I cannot see the dead man on my face. Daylight comes through the cracks and I can see his locked eyes. I am not big. Small rats do not wait for us to sleep. Someone is thrashing, but there is no room to do it in. If we had more to drink, we could make tears. We cannot make sweat or morning water, so the men without skin bring us theirs. One time they bring us sweet rocks to suck. We are all trying to leave our bodies behind. And this just continues on. I was like, oh, I'll find a place to stop reading, and it's not really. For like 4 pages, and you kind of don't know what's happening, and it's kind of creepy, and you're like really closely inside a perspective, but you don't know what you're looking at. And I think that's kind of what's unsettling. Like, I think of a horror film or even movies that aren't supposed to be horror but put me on edge. When you get a shot of someone and you don't, like, you only see from their view. So you don't know, like, who's behind you. Or you see the person walk into a space but you can't see the space and you're, like, ready for someone to jump out. Like, the conscious effort to leave things out can make things really unsettling because you're not sure where you're at or what's happening exactly.
Yeah, the Beloved is just an incredibly unsettling character, and you're never quite sure whether she's physically there or not. You're like, is everyone here just losing their minds? Or is she physically there? And how corporeal is she the whole time? You know, like, even if her spirit is there, are they the only ones who can see her? Like, it's really... You just kind of have to believe that she's a physical person, but the whole time you're doubting yourself. Another aspect of it that makes it not feel very real is the spirituality of the book. Is obviously there's, you know, a spirit or a ghost, but there's also in the memories, you know, in the flashbacks, once they're free, Baby Suggs is kind of like a spiritual leader in their community, and there's this region in the woods called the Clearing, which is where the living daughter, Denver, runs away to a lot. And it, again, feels like this place outside of time. Like, it's not quite real. And so I wanted to read a bit of that. When warm weather came, Baby Suggs, holy, followed by every black man, woman, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing. A wide-open place cut deep in the woods, nobody knew for what, at the end of the path known only to deer and whoever cleared the land in the first place. In the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while the people waited among the trees. After situating herself on a huge flat-sided rock, Baby Suggs bowed her head and prayed silently. The company watched her from the trees. They knew she was ready when she put her stick down. Then she shouted, "Let the children come," and they ran from the trees toward her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them, and the woods rang. The adults looked on and could not help smiling. "Then let the grown men come," she shouted. They stepped out one by one from among the ringing trees. "Let your wives and children see you dance," she told them, and ground life shuddered under their feet. Finally, she called the women to her. "Cry," she told them, "for the living and the dead. Just cry." And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. That whole sequence feels very otherworldly. I mean, beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not at all creepy, but really that's sort of, there's kind of a dark and light spirituality throughout the book. I think adds to the overall sense that, like, you don't quite know what's real.
It feels kind of generic to say, but the book it reads like great fiction, if that makes sense. Like, it's doing something interesting with language and something new to tell a really interesting and powerful and suspenseful story. But, like, it walks that, like, really fine line of, like, it doesn't overdo it, you know? I feel like it's one of those books you start reading and you're like, ah, yes, this is one that won prizes. This is fiction at its greatest.
Yeah.
While the style's spooky, you know, we get the supernatural from the get-go. Things are moving around and we're not quite sure where we are all the time. We do also have this, like, layer of suspense in the plot itself, and how the story unfolds. So at this time, so much has happened in the past, and kind of one of the big reveals that comes later is a past event, you know, kind of describing how we got to this place. The fact that Beloved was murdered by her mother. But we do get suspense throughout the whole book, and kind of suspense of, like, who is Beloved, like you already said, and when this character comes to reside at the house. So yeah, let's talk about why it's scary, not just, you know, a little spooky spiritual.
I mean, the thing that is fascinating to me is that the plot starts with the arrival of Paul D, who's a person from Setha's past. And the house that he arrives at is sort of the state that Setha and Denver are in, is they're kind of cut off from reality, and something kind of weird's going on with them, and their house is haunted. But it seems like they're kind of trying to be in their own world and not live in the real world. And his arrival brings up all of this remembering, and his arrival is what gets the plot started, because it starts the flashbacks and it tells us how we got to where we are. And so the suspense is created just by remembering, is just created by slowly revealing the past. You don't have to add any creatures or monsters or extra jump scares. You know what I mean? You don't have to add those extra things in order for this book to be suspenseful, to be terrifying, because the memories of formerly enslaved people are already horrific, as we've talked about. Like, they are already full of fear and real human people who are monstrous, right? And so just slowly revealing Setha's memories, and in addition to the style, is what makes this book really scary. And you don't have to add a lot to it, you know, which is why I think it works so well, of kind of straddling the line between, like, historical kind of literary fiction and this genre of horror. Her style elevates an already very terrifying but very real story.
Yeah, often in at least the handful of horror films I've seen and books I've read, you have someone who is uncovering something, you know, someone who stumbles into the haunted house and they're trying to figure out what happened there, or this family's been haunted for years, let's bring in the ghost catchers. Or, sorry, I know I'm, like, shitting on this entire genre right now. I'm sure there's so many people who'd be like, there's more nuance, there's more depth. But what I'm trying to say is that we don't have a character in this book who acts as our, like, stand-in, if that makes sense. So the reveal is happening to the reader, not to an individual character. There is a lot that Denver doesn't know and learns over time, but we're not given, like, her perspective solely through the whole novel as, like, seeing through her eyes. We're seeing through all of their eyes collectively, as well as kind of from an outside perspective.
Maybe the house.
Yeah, perhaps the house, but I feel like the house knows more than we do.
True.
That's
true.
my read, at least.
It does. Yeah, you're right.
So I think that is really artfully done to not have that device. And maybe that's what leaves us so uncertain where we're standing, because we don't have someone to like, okay, now I'm seeing from Denver's eyes, and this is what Denver knows and understands. It's all of it unfolding as we continue to read.
Yeah. Does Paul D know what happened?
I don't believe so, because he hasn't seen them. Like, he hasn't seen Setha since Sweet Home.
Right. So he knows about half the story. So in a way, he's the one who's kind of discovering, but he's not our way in, really.
Mm-hmm.
Because he knows a lot of the story already. Yeah. It kind of feels like the house is the one telling us the story. Like, it holds all the memories for them, in a way. And this book is... Because it's fascinating, you can have a horror novel where everyone already knows how it ends. You know what I mean? Except us. That's fascinating. It's like uncovering repressed trauma, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And we're watching. And it kind of feels like the house is like the collective of all of their memories put together. And it kind of holds them. Anyway, I just thought of that just now.
So speaking of the house, we talked about how horror often has monsters, an unknown creature or a known creature that is terrorizing or creating horror for the characters. But in this book, we don't necessarily have a monster. We kind of kicked around the idea before we started recording that the house kind of could be a character, but it's not really the monster. And Beloved doesn't really seem like the monster either, though she is the kind of supernatural, unknown, creepy, scary element.
She is a creature in the sense that she's not entirely a human being. And she, as the book goes on, she loses a lot of her initial humanness as well. But yeah, she's not a monster in this, like, even though she's haunting them, she's also a victim along with them, you know? And even by her mother's hand, but really they're both kind of co-victims of this, like, broader societal thing. And yeah, so like the supernatural elements are not the things that are terrorizing them. They're all just kind of natural parts of the process of remembering these really horrific events. So who is there a monster? Who's the real villain here in this story?
The entire system. All of the violence perpetrated on Black people in America. I think that the generational trauma that this Black family has, like, the monster isn't one thing you can point to, but it is the years of violence that has torn their family apart. The fact that Setha never knew her mother, you know, she only could point to her in a crowd. She has the mother figure of Baby Suggs to look up to, but Baby Suggs kind of gives up on life, it almost seems like, towards the end. And Beloved just holds on to her motherhood and almost terrorizes herself with knowing what she did to Beloved. And whether or not you read Beloved as a physical character, physical being that actually comes and lives with them, or if it's like the embodiment of that trauma and violence coming and living within them. I don't think there's one monster you can point to, but it's definitely a horrifying situation. Because,
like, maybe the obvious answer would be school teacher, the most cruel master they had, and, you know, him finding her children was kind of the instigator for her trying to kill Beloved, but he's not the only one. You know what I mean? It's not like he's a singular monster. It's kind of like he's one head of the Hydra. You know what I mean? Of this invisible Hydra that is the economic and governmental and law enforcement system that upholds slavery and enacted all this violence on generations of their family. And so you don't, I keep saying this over and over, but you don't need to embellish that in order to make it a horror story. You just need to tell it as it was and maybe add some stylizing to make it a good book. Yeah, burn it all down, man. Because if you cut off one of the Hydra's heads, it grows 2 more.
So to close out our conversation on Beloved, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface of what this book holds, I wanted to turn to the very beginning, to the dedication of this book, which is 60 million and more. And this refers to the people who were enslaved and those who were killed, died in slavery, or in results of, and aren't remembered, whose names aren't recorded, whose family members may not know or may not be able to trace back their lineage to that point. And so by telling the story Beloved, Toni Morrison is helping us all remember and face the violence, remember the horrible history, and how know where a lot of the issues in our society trace back to. I also find it interesting at the very end, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, Julia, where this whole book is about remembering, but at the very end,
the whole town forgets.
Yeah, everyone forgets.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you think that forgetting, what is Toni Morrison saying about that forgetting? Is it important? Is it a part of the process? Is it what we have done but we shouldn't have done? Or what the Black community has to do in order to move forward, you know?
How many white people are in that town?
True.
Because that would have different implications for me. The willful forgetting of white people of things that our ancestors have perpetrated versus the necessary forgetting of traumatized people of their trauma in order to continue living their lives. You can't be constantly remembering something like that if you're going to function and feed yourself and, like, hold a job. Like, you know, that you can't, like, the human brain, the human body can't hold all that all the time. So I think it depends on who's doing the forgetting, but the ending to me felt like a breath out in a way. Like, there was a sense of resolution of, like, okay, they're not actively being haunted anymore. The immediate threat is gone. They can continue kind of living their lives, sort of. You know, there's some hope for Denver, at least, you know? But at the same time, they're still haunted. They're just not actively remembering it every second of the day, which was kind of what Beloved represented, I think. So it's, you know, it's still creepy in the sense that, like, we're all haunted by those unnamed people that have been forgotten, but that was my feeling at the end.
I do like what you said about it being kind of like an exhale, like a breath out at the end. You do kind of get this meaningful moment between Setha and Paul D at the very end, where he says, Setha, me and you, we got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow. He leans over and takes her hand. With the other, he touches her face. You your best thing, Setha. You are. His holding fingers are holding hers. And then in quotes, me. And, you know, out of context, it's like a very sentimental thing of, like, let's build a future together. Like, remember, like, you're the best thing for you. You know, like, you are your best thing. Like, not your daughter you have, the daughter you lost, the past you had. Like, you are, like, an individual and, like, of value. But knowing all the weight of everything that's unfolded before that moment, those statements carry so much more.
Yeah.
You know what he means when he says, we have more yesterdays than anybody.
Ooh, yeah. Wow, what a good book.
Yeah. I didn't mention this in the author bio, but there is a movie starring Oprah Winfrey that I'm curious to read. It has, like, low ratings on, like, if you just do a Google search. So I'm curious. I'm just intrigued how they decided to portray it. cinematically.
I feel like they probably took the horror element out of it. It's just my guess, and it probably wasn't as good. Also, love Oprah. Not a huge fan of her as an actor.
I'm trying to think if I've ever seen her in anything like acting, not her as a host and producer or anything like that.
watched, she comes back to act every once in a while for a story that she really cares about. And there was an HBO film adaptation of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks about the woman who they took stem cells from her without her consent, and then her stem cells are basically the ones that are used to fuel like every single medical discovery since then. And so it's the like uncovering of that by future generations. And Oprah was in that, and I did not really like her in it. Like as an actor, I was like, yeah, she's okay. I just like her as a person better, I think. I just want her to be herself.
Okay, so for people who have finished reading this book and they're looking for more, what would you recommend they check out next?
If you're a fan of using or of like Black creators using alternative genres to like tell the stories of African Americans, the show Atlanta by Donald Glover on Hulu is really good and really weird. It's kind of surrealist, I think is the best way to describe it, about a Black man in Atlanta trying to make it as a rapper. And one of his friends, played by Lakeith Stanfield, who I'm a big fan of all of his work, he's just kind of always in this other dimension in which like he's never quite there, and he'll say these things and you're just like, what? And the plot is very surrealist, and it's a very bizarre show, but really, really well written. And then if you're gonna read another Toni Morrison book, I would say try Tar Baby.
I would recommend, similarly, read more Toni Morrison. She has so much out there. But Beloved is actually the first part in what is referred to as a trilogy. The characters don't continue, but it's similar themes. So I'm intrigued how it got dubbed a trilogy, if that was Morrison's doing or publishers. But the two books that came after Beloved were Jazz and Paradise. So if you're looking to continue in this very similar vein, stick with those. And then otherwise, we've talked on the podcast before about Friday Black. It's a short story collection by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brener, which uses horror to talk about the Black experience in America. And, off the top of my head, I just remembered Her Body and Other Parties.
Yeah.
Some of the stories in that collection as well are horror to talk about the experience of women. And that is by Carmen Maria Machado is the author of that collection. Okay. Changing all the gears, shifting to a completely different dimension. What are things that are bringing you joy lately? What are you currently obsessed with?
Recently discovered the album American Boyfriend by Kevin Abstract. It's an older one. He's from the boy group Brockhampton, which I'm not like a huge fan of, but I really love Kevin Abstract's solo work. And then Atypical Season 3 is out on Netflix. I have not watched it yet, but I am about to. And then today, as of this moment, what I'm currently obsessed with is a new story from the Olympics about the two top high jumpers. One's from Qatar and one's from Italy. And they just both like keep one-upping each other and keep matching each other until there's one height that neither of them can jump. And so they like just give each other a big hug and like decide to share the gold medal.
That's so sweet.
And it just is, it's so adorable. I'm obsessed with it. And they both look so happy, and it just was a lot of hugging, and it's great. I'm like, if this was all of what the Olympics was, I would be down.
So I recently moved out of our old apartment, and now I severely downsized in a positive way. So I was getting rid of a bunch of things. I had a whole stack of these graphic tees that I love the look of the front of and the design on it, but like they're all like longer or kind of boxy or like just like I don't wear them as much. And I've been really into crop tops lately, so I took, you know, a note from literally everyone who's been doing this since like 2010 and like cutting up t-shirts. But I just cut up a bunch of my old graphic tees into crop tops and it's great. I feel like I have a whole new wardrobe and yeah, it's awesome. I've been wearing all these shirts that I've been like buried away, including my super metal looking Crime and Punishment t-shirt.
Oh my God. I love that shirt.
It's so fun. And Lawrence, the band, just released a new album called Hotel TV that we have been playing nonstop. My friend has it completely memorized because we were listening to it as we were packing the entire house. Yeah, we just put it on and we all sing along in our house and it's a great time. So check out Hotel TV by Lawrence. Oh, and lastly, a woman that I really look up to as an entrepreneur and just general cool person, Anna, has launched these like moon circle groups. It sounds very woo-woo, but it's twice a month on the full moon and the new moon, joining a Zoom call with other women. Anna Locke is her name, Locke. She leads these groups and we'll do a meditation and a reflection, maybe pull a like intention card. And then if you do the live call, the last half is just checking in with everyone else on the call and hearing what the evening brought up for them. And I don't know, it's been really enjoyable and like really great for me to just block off like an entire hour every 2 weeks or so where it's like, this is just me checking in with myself and reflecting, which you can do without, you know, paying to be a part of a moon circle group. But for me, it's nice to have it like blocked off on my calendar. I'm much more able to remember to give myself time if it's like scheduled versus just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna, you know, take care of myself sometime.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Chime in with your own thoughts and recommendations on Instagram at bookclubwithjv or through the contact form on our website, www.bookclubwithjv.com. Our website is also where you can find show notes for this episode, which include links to any of the recommendations we gave or other tidbits we mentioned. Make sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're currently listening, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple while you're there. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland, and Rebecca Gesney is our project manager. We'll catch you all on our next episode. Happy reading!